Pilgrim's Progress was the life of John Bunyan told in allegory, as the life of all Christians. Pilgrim's Regress is C.S. Lewis, who was raised and exposed to Christianity and then went away from it, and he talks about his withdrawing and then God's work in finally bringing him around. This is very early in the book, Regress. I want you to hear it. This is about a dream that a boy had whose name was John in Puritania. You see, John did something. And John was spoken to by a cook there who was very angry with him. And she scolded him and smacked him for having killed a bird in the garden. Why, said John, why did you do this? And she said, because the steward would be very angry, said the cook. Who's the steward? Said John. He's the man who makes the rules for the country around here, she said. Why, said John? Because the landlord sent him. Who's the landlord? Who's the steward? The steward is the pastor, and the landlord is the Lord Almighty. Well, who's the landlord? Said John. Well, he owns all the country, she said. Why, said John. And the cook looked at him, and she went and told his mom. And his mom sat down and talked to John all afternoon about the landlord. But John really didn't get it. He didn't take any of it in, for he was not yet of an age for taking it in, so John says. Then a year went by, and one dark, cold, wet morning, John was made to put on new clothes. And they were the ugliest clothes that he'd ever put on, which John had a mind to at all. And they caught him up, and his father and his mother took him along a road, each one taking one of his hands, which was very uncomfortable, and they took him to see the steward. And the steward lived in a dark house by the side of the road, and father and mother went in to talk to the steward first, and John was left there sitting in a hall chair that was so high that his feet couldn't reach the floor. And there was other chairs in the hall there, and he could have sat in more comfort, but his father told him that the steward would be angry if he got up out of his chair. So, there he was. So he had to sit very still and be very good. And John was beginning to be afraid as he sat still in the high chair with his feet dangling and his clothes itching all over him and his eyes staring out of his head. And after a long while, his parents came back looking as if they had been with the doctor. Very grave. And then they said to John that he must go in and see the steward too. And John came into the room, and there was an old man with a red, round face who was very kind and full of jokes. And so John quite got over his fear. And he had a good time talking to the steward about fishing and fish tackle and bicycles. But just when the talk was at its best, the steward got up and he cleared his throat, and then he took a mask down from the wall that was hanging there with a long white beard attached to it, and suddenly he clapped it on his face so that it appeared was awful. It was just awful. And he said, "Now, I'm going to talk to you about the landlord. And the landlord owns all the country. And he is very, very kind of him to allow us to live on it at all. Very, very kind. And he went on repeating the very kind in such a weird sing-songy voice so that John would have laughed. But he was beginning to be frightened again. And the steward took down from the peg a big card with small print all over it. And he says, "Here is a list of all the things the landlord says you must not do. And you better look at it." So John took the card. And half the rules seemed to forbid things he'd never heard of. And the other half forbid things that he was doing every day and could not imagine not doing. And the number of the rules was so enormous that he felt he could never remember them all. "I hope," said the steward, "that you have not already broken any of these rules." And John's heart began to thump. His eyes bulged more and more. He was at his wit's end when the steward took off the mask and looked at John with his real face and said, "Better tell a lie. Old chap, better tell a lie. Easiest for all concerned." And popping the mask back on his face in a flash, John gulped and said quickly, "Oh, no, sir." He'd never done those. "That's just as well," said the steward through the mask, "because you know that if you did break any of them and the landlord got to know it, why, do you know what he'd do to you?" "No, sir," said John. And the steward's eyes seemed to be twinkling dreadfully through the holes of the mask. "He'd take you and he'd shut you up forever and ever in a black hole full of snakes and scorpions as large as lobsters forever and ever. And besides that, he is such a kind and good man, so very, very kind that I'm sure you would never want to displease him." "No, sir," said John. "But please, sir." "Well," said the steward, "please, sir, supposing I did break one little one, just by accident, you know, supposing. Could nothing stop the snakes and the lobsters?" "Ah," said the steward. And then he sat down and talked for a long time, but John couldn't understand a single syllable. However, it all ended with pointing out that the landlord was quite extraordinarily kind and good to tenants and would certainly have tortured most of them to death the moment he had the slightest pretext. "And you can't blame him," said the steward, "for after all, it is his land, and he's so very good of him to let us live here at all, people like us, you know." Then the steward took off the mask, and with a nice, sensible chat with John again, gave him a cake and brought him out to his father and mother. And just as they were about to be going, he bent down and he whispered in John's ear, "Shouldn't bother about it all too much if I were you," quote unquote. At the same time, he slipped the card with all the rules into John's hand. And he told him he could keep it for his own use. Woo! What is that about? It's about what the church does. You see what they do? They take the laws of God And nobody keeps them because we can't keep them. And it says, don't bother about it all that much when those laws are going to crush us. And they become Nicolaitans. 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 How? Because they proclaim the Word of God. And then they tell people that they don't really have to be all that concerned. Just do this. And they wrongly use the law.